On Good Friday, 1014, Ireland's High King faced the Vikings at Clontarf, a battle that changed the fate of Ireland. Welcome to Past Frame, the channel where history's most epic moments come alive. In today's video, we'll uncover the dramatic story of the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where High King Brian Boru led his forces against the Vikings of Dublin and their Irish allies. We'll see how Ireland, divided into rival kingdoms, came together under Brian Boru, how the Norse settlers and their allies gathered to resist him, and how the battle turned into one of the bloodiest clashes in Irish history. We'll also uncover the tragic end of Brian Boru himself, and why this battle, though costly for both sides, became remembered as the symbolic end of Viking power in Ireland. If you love real history told with cinematic depth, make sure to subscribe to Past Frame, because today, we relive the clash of Vikings and Irish at Clontarf. At the dawn of the 11th century, Ireland was a land of rival kingdoms, each ruled by its own king, each fighting for power and survival. Unlike England or France, there was no single united crown. Instead, the island was divided between powerful dynasties: Leinster, Munster, Connacht, Ulster, each vying for supremacy. For over 2 centuries, another force had added to this struggle: the Vikings. Since their first raids in the late 8th century, Norse warriors had carved settlements along Ireland's coasts. Cities like Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, and Wexford were founded or controlled by them, becoming strongholds of trade and piracy. Their longships carried silver, slaves, and weapons, and their presence altered the politics of the island forever. By the late 10th century, one man rose above the chaos: Brian Boru, King of Munster. A brilliant warrior and strategist, he defeated rival Irish kings and gradually extended his authority. In 1002, he claimed the title of High King of Ireland, something no man had held with real power for generations. But Brian's rise was not uncontested. His rule brought him into direct conflict with rival Irish kings who resented his authority, and with the Norse Gaels of Dublin, who feared the loss of their independence. Among his fiercest opponents was Mael Morda, King of Leinster, and his ally Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Norse King of Dublin. In 1013, rebellion flared. Leinster and Dublin allied against Brian, calling for help from Viking warriors overseas, from the Isle of Man, from Orkney, from the far-off Norse world. Ships filled with battle-hardened fighters crossed the seas to answer the call. Brian too gathered his strength. Warriors from Munster, Connacht, and parts of Ulster rallied under his banner. Though he was nearly 70 years old, Brian Boru prepared to face his enemies in one final, decisive battle. The stage was set. On the eve of Good Friday, 23rd April 1014, 2 great forces gathered outside Dublin on the fields of Clontarf. What followed would be remembered as one of the bloodiest battles in Irish history. The morning of 23rd April, 1014, Good Friday, broke cold and grey over the fields of Clontarf, just outside Dublin. The tide of the River Liffey lapped against the shore, and mist clung to the ground as 2 great armies prepared to meet. On one side stood the forces of High King Brian Boru. Though nearly 70 years old, Brian had gathered men from across Ireland, warriors from Munster, Connacht, and even parts of Ulster. His son Murshad commanded the army in the field, leading thousands of Irish fighters armed with spears, axes, and shields. On the other side, the alliance of Dublin and Leinster waited. King Mael Morda of Leinster stood with his men, alongside Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Norse ruler of Dublin. Around them gathered Viking mercenaries from the Isle of Man, from the Hebrides, and from the distant Orkney Islands, seasoned fighters who had crossed the sea to answer the call. Among them were feared leaders like Sigurd of Orkney and Brodir of Man, men whose names carried terror. The battle began with the thunder of war cries. The Irish surged forward, clashing with Viking shield walls. Spears flew, axes bit into wood and flesh, and the air filled with the roar of combat. Brian Boru himself did not take the field. Age and weakness kept him from battle, and he remained in his tent, praying as the fight unfolded. But his presence inspired his men. They fought not only for victory, but for the honor of Ireland and their king. As the morning wore on, the fighting raged along the shore. The tide, creeping slowly in, began to trap Viking longships on the strand, cutting off their retreat. Yet the Norse warriors fought with desperate courage, and the fields of Clontarf became a killing ground. The battle had begun, a clash of kingdoms, cultures, and faiths. By the day's end, neither side would emerge unscarred. By midday on Good Friday, 1014, the Battle of Clontarf had reached its height. The fields outside Dublin shook with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the relentless roar of combat. The Viking and Leinster alliance fought with savage determination. Sigurd of Orkney, towering above his men, carried his massive banner into the thick of battle, his warriors forming a wall of shields around him. Brodir of Man, clad in black armor, was said to fight with such fury that none dared face him head-on. For hours, they pushed back Brian Boru's men, their axes cutting down the Irish ranks in bloody swaths. But the Irish refused to break. At the center, Brian's son Murshad led charge after charge, rallying his men with cries of defiance. He struck down Viking after Viking, his sword flashing in the sunlight, until his very presence became a symbol of resistance. Around him, the warriors of Munster and Connaught fought with desperate courage, knowing their king was watching and praying for them. The fighting swayed back and forth across the shoreline. Men grappled hand to hand, slipping in mud and blood, locked in combat so fierce that whole companies were wiped out where they stood. As the day wore on, nature itself turned against the Vikings. The tide, which had gone out in the morning, now came rushing back in. Longships that had carried Viking warriors onto the shore were trapped, their escape routes cut off. What had been a battlefield became a trap, and many Norse fighters found themselves pinned between the rising sea and the Irish spears. Still, the Norse fought on with grim ferocity, even as exhaustion and the sea closed in. Sigurd of Orkney fell in the fighting, his great banner captured. The sight shook the Viking ranks. One by one, their leaders were cut down. The momentum shifted. What had begun as a desperate clash was turning into an Irish victory. But victory would come at a terrible cost. As the sun began to sink on Good Friday, 1014, the tide of battle had turned. The Norse and their Leinster allies were broken, their ships destroyed, their leaders slain. The Irish stood bloodied but victorious. Yet even in triumph, tragedy waited. Far from the battlefield, in a tent overlooking the fight, sat Brian Boru, the aged High King of Ireland. At nearly 70 years old, he was too frail to take the field. Instead, he prayed through the day, his hands raised for his warriors, calling on God to give them strength. But not all of the Vikings had fled. Brodir of Man, the dark-clad warrior whose rage had driven him through the battle, had survived the collapse of his army. Leading a band of men, he cut his way toward Brian's camp. The defenders tried to resist, but Brodir forced his way inside. There, he found the High King. Brian rose to meet him, armed only with a sword. In that final moment, the old king still stood tall, unshaken, ready to face death as he had faced life, with courage. The clash was brief. Brodir struck Brian down, ending the life of the man who had united Ireland. But the victory was hollow. As Brodir tried to escape, he was captured and killed in turn by Irish warriors. His body was torn apart, his death as violent as his life. When news spread across the field that Brian Boru had fallen, grief struck his men. They had won the battle, but lost the king who had led them there. The triumph of Clontarf was stained with tragedy. Ireland had broken the Viking power, but it had also lost the one man who might have truly united the island under a lasting crown. When the fighting ended on Good Friday, 1014, the fields of Clontarf fell silent. The ground was littered with shattered shields, broken swords, and the bodies of thousands of fallen warriors. Both Viking and Irish blood stained the earth. For the Vikings and their allies, it was a devastating defeat. Their leaders, Sigurd of Orkney, Brodir of Man, and Morda of Leinster, were slain. Their fleets were scattered, their warriors crushed. Viking merchants would remain in Ireland, but never again would the Norse threaten to conquer the island. For the Irish, victory came at a terrible cost. Brian Boru's son, Murshad, who had fought at the front lines, was killed. And the High King himself, too old to take the field, was struck down in his tent before the battle ended. Ireland had broken the Viking threat, but it had also lost the man who had risen from Munster to unite the land. In the years that followed, Ireland slipped back into rivalry and division. Without Brian's leadership, no king could hold the High Kingship with true power. The dream of a united Ireland faded, yet Clontarf lived on in memory. To later generations, it became more than a battle. It was a legend, a story of defiance and sacrifice. When Ireland stood against Viking might and prevailed, even at the highest cost, Brian Boru was remembered not only as a king, but as a national hero. His legacy carried for over 1,000 years. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 was more than a clash of armies. It was the end of an age. Viking power in Ireland was broken, but so too was the dream of lasting unity. Brian Boru had risen from the King of Munster to the High King of Ireland. In victory, he gave his people pride and defiance. In death, he gave them a legend. Clontarf was both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that history's greatest moments are often written in blood and sacrifice. This was Clontarf, 1014, the battle that reshaped Ireland. If you want to see history brought to life with cinematic depth and real detail, make sure to subscribe to Past Frame, where the world's most epic moments come alive once more.